our cultures will change dramatically over time, and it already has, of course. I mean, think how much our culture's changed in the last 100 years or 200 years. You know, it's just dramatically changing, and it's continuing to change.
Roger, you are Professor Emeritus at Yale University, and I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's a great pleasure.
We live in such a technologically driven world right now. I'm interested to see why you think that's, well, first of all, please explain in detail like what the thesis of your paper, and then how technology is playing into that.
Okay. Charles Darwin really had some great theories, and I believe in those theories. It's just that they are being overridden by humans nowadays. And that's sort of the key. Humans are overriding evolution, Darwinian, really genetic evolution, for humans themselves, of course, for their domesticated species and so forth, the plants and animals, but they're also having a big impact on the other species of the planet. And that's what this is all about, and I think probably what's most unique about what I have to say is how humans themselves are basically overriding their own Darwinism with technology and culture.
But if humans are adapting by using technology, isn't that in a way Darwinism? It's just taking a sort of unnatural approach to basically trying to prolong our lives and look after our own.
Well, it's not genetically adapting. And actually, Darwin had debates with Alfred Wallace at the time, back in the 1860s and 70s, about what technology was doing and so forth. So you recognize that humans had the capability to create technology. The key driver here really has to do with what has happened with why we are really not genetically evolving anymore. And that has to do with the fact that all of our children survive. Almost all of our children survive. One of the key to how evolution works under Darwinism is you have a lot of offspring, and many offspring, you know, multiples of offsprings of what you actually survive, and only a minority survive. The average offspring, these are variations, they don't really do as well as their parents on average, because the parents already were somewhat adapted, and the offspring are not quite as well adapted. And then if they're not quite as well adapted, the average would be worse. But the key to Darwinism is that what's been called the survival of the fittest. So basically the most adaptable survive, and so that minority that's most adaptable survives, and that group is more adaptable than their parents. And that's how the species and so forth evolve. But that's broken by humans when we basically, with our technology and so forth, have most of our children survive nowadays.
Right. So I mean, if I understand what you're saying, are you saying that we're actually doing ourselves a disservice now by using so much technology, and we're not allowing our species to actually basically improve naturally? We're just continually using new medicines and new technology to kind of, I don't know how else to say this, but sort of keep people who should have died at a younger age alive, and that's not a healthy thing for our society?
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we want our children to survive. It's obviously really devastating to lose a child and so forth. Although that was routine in a couple hundred years ago, you lost the majority of your children. But it's certainly, we want our children to survive. I'm not saying we don't want it, but the key here is we want our children to survive, but once that happens, the population explodes. And that's what happened. The population in 1800 was 1 billion people, and it's really approaching 8 billion now. So it's gone up 8 times, and it would continue to grow if we didn't do something about it, but we actually are doing something about it.
Well, how do you see the outlook for population now? I mean, there's a lot of commentators out there who, I'm actually just thinking of Elon Musk, who did an interview quite recently, who said, mark my words, the biggest problem we've got right now is there's not enough people having children. But it seems like you're taking potentially the other side of that, or maybe your much bigger picture. How do you see population growth going from here?
Well, I think it's going to top out at some number. I don't know if it's going to be 9...
Like 10 billion, 12 billion?
9, 10, 12, 13, whatever. These are the different estimates that we have. And so it's going to top out. The transition is that the population ages, and so it's what Elon Musk is talking about is how the population's aging and how that's a transition to go through. But think of the other, if we didn't do something about it. If it went from 1 billion to 8 billion in 200 years, and then think what would happen in another, go up another 8 times, up to 64 times the amount, 64 billion in another 200 years. We'd have to do something about this, and we have. And one of the big things, we've created all kinds of technology, of course, and I got to say, all the while, the reason why Malthus wasn't correct was because, in fact, with our technology and with our culture, we actually grew faster than the population was growing. So our per capita income kept on rising. It's dramatically risen over this period. So we're surviving fine.
I'm trying to remind myself about Malthusian principles, but I think essentially populations typically expand exponentially, but food or the supplies needed to live is a linear relationship. So you naturally get populations that just die out from overpopulation. Is that sort of vaguely it?
Essentially, when some technology comes, the population grows to the point where it outruns its resources, as you described. And it's not really right, because food did grow exponentially, and actually food's become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And it's
because we found ways to produce it for less and less and less.
Yes. One of the big things is industrial agriculture here. So actually, humans actually became better and better and better off, but they are displacing the other species of the world. That's the real problem here. Humans can adapt, and they probably could adapt at much larger populations. But can you imagine going from 1 billion to 8 billion, and then if that's exponentially just keeps on growing at those kind of rates? Well, I'll tell you how we have adapted, though. The key is really empowering women, because once you empower women, give them a chance to basically choose the kind of rates, the fertility rates.
And by empowering women, you mean giving them control over their own bodies in terms of, birth control and things like that?
Yes, and essentially I have charts and so forth that relate, like education attainment. As women get more educated, they have less children. Essentially, because they have more control, they're empowered to do what they want to do, in fact. And they invest much more, the key is, much more in each child. So this, contrary to what Elon Musk might think, the fact that it's much more important to invest how much you invest in a child than how many children you have.
Right. Christopher Hitchens, who sadly passed away a few years ago, he made a very similar point about empowering women having a direct correlation to actually the success of an economy generally.
Yeah, so I'm talking about a successive economy where people get the amount of children they really want to have. And yes, there is a transition. The economy ages, of course, but by the fact that these children have so much invested in the children that we do have, it far more makes up for any shortfalls in population.
What do you think policymakers should be doing to sort of, address these issues?
Well, I think they should keep on empowering women. I guess that's the main thing they should, from the human perspective.
Yeah.
I think, though, I have concerns about the other species. The domesticated species, I think we should do something there too, because I'm not saying we shouldn't domesticate them, but we should treat them better. In fact, agriculture in the U.S., for example, is the actual growing of crops and so forth and raising animals is less than 2% of our economy. A bigger part is food, where you have to distribute it and package it and process it and so forth. But essentially, agriculture is such a small part of the economy, but it's a large part of the destruction. And the animals themselves are usually not treated well and so forth. So we should do something about that. But then the larger picture, all these wilder species, they're getting heavily impacted because they can't adapt quickly enough. Evolution's a slow process, and so many of them can't, particularly the higher order animals, cannot adapt to, say, climate change or to pesticides and herbicides and hunting and whatever. All these things are really impacting the other species of the world.
Right. So the domesticated animals that we can take control of, we obviously need to pay better attention to, but the wilder animals, I guess we just don't know what the impact is if they start going extinct and we start losing the fish in the sea. Is that kind of the point you're saying, is that we don't know how these impacts will affect us going forward?
Well, I don't necessarily look at it from the perspective of us.
Okay.
I,
You think about the globe.
I'm not only a global thinker
Uh-huh.
who thinks across the millennium, but I'm also a thinker who thinks across the species. And from their perspective, they're having many of the species are having great difficulty.
Yeah.
However, the majority, and I have a chart on this, the majority of the biomass of the Earth is really not that affected. I mean, actually almost 80% of the biomass of the Earth is plants in form, and wild plants are, for the most part, doing okay. Not so much some of the trees maybe, but most of them are doing okay. And then the biggest other chunk of biomass is actually bacteria. And I don't see us at this point anyway hurting that. So from a biomass perspective, we're not necessarily impacting that much. Humans actually make up less than 0.01% of the biomass of the Earth. So we're a very small part of the biomass, although we have a pretty big impact on a lot of other things. Animals, as a group, have only 0.37% of the biomass of the Earth. When you think of living things, we're thinking of humans and mammals or something, and animals, but actually it's not. It's really bacteria and plants and things and fungi and other things that are really dominating the biomass of the Earth. So we're not doing. I guess one of my real goals is to put the whole thing in the overall perspective, so people can really understand what's going on.
Yeah, we need to be looking much bigger picture, I guess, because we're such a small part of it all.
Yes, and so that's what I'm doing. I'm really looking at this from the top-down perspective, not only from humans, but from the broader all species perspective, and not only from today and what this next generation, my lifetime, might face, but what the millennium will face. That's the perspective I'm looking at. But I think it could inform us about policy choices.
Yeah. Well, if I could bring it a little more towards today, or this 100 years.
Well, that hurts me to do that, but I'm trying to move toward today. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about the about deglobalization, which is a trend that has been with us for a few years, and I think is set to continue. Maybe based on some of your findings, how do you think that sort of plays out from a sort of global markets point of view, and what do we need to be doing to prepare for that?
I don't know that. I think, let me say from today's perspective, globalization is harmful for the economy because we benefit a lot from globalization. That's one of the core things about trade. Essentially, is beneficial, and whether it's trade in people or in migration or whatever, or in goods or whatever activities we take on, these are all beneficial to making us more efficient. So this will make us less efficient, but I won't say that's really the topic of this particular paper. But of course, I am an economist, so you can, any questions, fair game here.
Well, I'm really trying to think about. I was actually trying to think more about inflation and like inflationary pressures that the world is seeing today, and I don't know if population is a factor in it today, but I think certainly deglobalization is, and the role of central banks trying to control that and whether they're going to be able to control that. So maybe with your economist hat on, how do you see the sort of outlook for, let's say, the US economy right now with regards to inflation?
Well, I think that, frankly, this has been mishandled. I think that the Fed balance sheet has been pumped up to record levels. There's never been anything like this historically. And the stimulus packages and even before that, the Trump tax cuts and so forth, all this was happening during booming economies and basically they didn't need all this. And what happens, well, first it went into the markets, so the markets exploded in prices. Prices went up. And with a delay, it went into goods. But the Fed should have really reacted earlier. This was pretty obvious that this was happening, at least maybe obvious to me. Long ago that we were really getting some more potential permanent inflation. It wasn't this transitory inflation, all supply driven that they were talking about.
Well, thinking about big picture ideas, I mean, if you look at stimulus that's been injected into economies, I mean, the amount of stimulus that's been injected just into the US economy since 2008, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it just dwarfs anything that's happened in previous decades all put together. And at some point, that has to play out through the economy. There has to be some kind of unwind. And how do you think that, I mean, the Fed just started QT recently, quantitative tightening, to reverse the QE that it was using. But can you give us an idea of how you think that plays out for the consumer and for the economy?
It ultimately is showing up as inflation, and that's what's happening. And inflation, you can probably do a lot of things without creating inflation, as we did. But once you push it too far, once the truck gets moving, it's hard to stop. And and now we're starting to put the brakes on, but it's very.
It's not a speedboat; it's an aircraft carrier, so it's going to take a long time to turn.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation here. So I see inflation coming in. Of course, inflation. Well, it distorts the economy quite a bit to have high inflation. Of course, and the icing on the cake was the Ukraine war, which caused the energy prices to soar. All these things mean that we're going to have, potentially a recession and things like that related to this.
So, Roger, I wanted to ask one last topic, and I don't know how Darwinian this is, but if we can circle back to our original topic, the rise of digital assets and indeed possibly the metaverse are topics that are on people's horizons right now. How do you think about the metaverse and how big a part that will be in our lives going forward?
Once humans, I guess, become
robots in a vat, brains in a vat.
Yeah, well, once we become something else. This, by the way, all that was stimulated by the big money supply, though, by the way, because that money flew in and had to go somewhere, and it started going into.
So you really believe that the fiscal stimulus packages of the last 5 to 10 years were a main proponent of drivers in cryptocurrencies and digital assets?
Both fiscal and monetary. And the fiscal, by the way, it's our debt in the U.S. is bigger than the debt at the end of World War II relative to GDP. This kind of extreme fiscal and monetary policies got into the economy, first by rising asset prices, but ultimately by causing inflation to rise.
Right, so I completely understand the argument that their prices would have been, of things like Bitcoin, for example, have been inflated because there's so much money pumped in, it had to go somewhere. But do you see that there's an academic argument for these digital assets to exist in terms of creating more efficiencies in the monetary system? And are we going to be spending more time in an alternative reality?
Well, I certainly believe blockchain is a technology that's going to take on big roles, and the governments may basically be using blockchain to create their own currencies. Yeah. So I don't know about these private currencies and whether they're going to dominate or not. And then the metaverse of that we can have alternative lives and so forth. All those things certainly seem like possibilities. We can become our cultures will change dramatically over time, and it already has, of course. I mean, think how much our culture's changed in the last 100 years or 200 years. It's just dramatically changing, and it's continuing to change. And so it's hard for me. I don't personally live in the metaverse so much, so I don't have a good sense of what how you could live in that. Live several lives at the same time or something like that, and treat each one of them as important as another. I don't know. That's all those things are possibilities, I guess, but well, I'm not probably the expert on that.
Well, one thing I know for sure, Roger, it's been great to meet you in real life outside the metaverse, and thank you very much for your time.
Well, it's certainly great to talk to you.
Thank you.